Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. The Underworld River Restricted Area was one of a few restricted areas in the wildlands. The reason such areas came to be called restricted was that ordinary soul cultivators would have a difficult time even getting into them, and if they succeeded in that effort, would most likely die as a result. The only way to safely traverse such areas was with special command medallions. Not surprisingly, the Underworld River Restricted Area actually contained a river. During the day, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary, dried-up riverbed. However, after midnight passed, the Underworld River would manifest, flowing through the area for some distance before disappearing off into the night. Thus, the area came to be a restricted area. After all, the Underworld River was normally illusory, and would only appear in the world of men under special circumstances or using special techniques. But in this area, the Underworld River would naturally appear every night after midnight. Of course, all of the Wildlands restricted areas had unique objects which would appear. Such objects were used in the Arch-Emperor dynasty both for cultivation purposes, and also as a means of repairing the enormous magical device that was Arch-Emperor City. For example, in the Underworld River restricted area, there were underworld rainbows which would appear over the river at night. They were illusory, and also temporary, but by using special techniques, it was possible to harvest them. Because of this general state of affairs, the restricted areas were encamped by military forces from Arch-Emperor City year-round. As for the Underworld River restricted area, there was a brigade of 3,000 men garrisoned there. The most powerful of the soldiers was in the Great Circle of the nascent soul stage. He was not a heavenly marquis, but rather, one of the Grand Heaven Master's private guards. Most of the other soul cultivators were in the core formation stage. Although it might seem like a stretch to say that these 3,000 could protect Bai Xiaochun, the truth was that since they reported directly to the Grand Heaven Master, they were more powerful than they appeared based on cultivation base alone. Although there were definitely members of the nobility and aristocracy who would secretly make a move against Bai Xiaochun, not even the 4 heavenly kings would casually cross the Grand Heaven Master. Wiping out that force would be equivalent to declaring war on the Grand Heaven Master. As for the brigade's general mission, it was simply to harvest underworld rainbows. Bai Xiaochun and Zhou Yixing spent a few days traveling to the Underworld River restricted area. Bai Xiaochun wasn't in a hurry, and proceeded along at a steady pace in the heavenly airship. Although the landscape in the wildlands was barren and bleak, that didn't dampen Bai Xiaochun's mood at all. In fact, he took time to visit many of the necromancer clans along the way, and they would always shower him with gifts. Overall, it was a lovely trip. When they finally reached the Underworld River restricted area, it was evening. The 3,000 soldiers stationed there had been notified that he would be arriving, and were waiting in ranks to receive him. There were 5 men standing out in front of the brigade, all of whom were nascent soul experts. One of them was a middle-aged man, who was none other than the colonel in command of the brigade. Standing a pace behind him were the 4 other nascent soul experts, 2 of whom were in the late stage, and 2 in the mid-stage. They were already well informed as to who Bai Xiaochun was. They knew that he was not only an earthly necromancer, but he was also the type of person who could shake all of the wildlands with a single stamp of his foot. Furthermore, because they were from the Grand Heaven Master's private guard, and had received special orders from him to do anything that Bai Xiaochun said, none of them hesitated for even a moment to treat him with the utmost respect. As the group waited, Bai Xiaochun's heavenly airship appeared off in the distance and then floated toward them through the air. When it came to a stop, Zhou Yixing flew out, landed on the ground, and then looked around vigilantly, the way that a loyal attendant would. When his gaze came to rest on the brigade of 3,000 men, he looked surprised. After studying the situation more closely to ensure that there were no hidden dangers, he took a few steps backward, then turned to the heavenly airship and clasped hands. "Grandmaster Bai, your presence is requested," he said in a loud voice. The colonel of the brigade hesitated for only a moment before clasping hands and calling out in similar fashion. Afterward, the entire brigade gave voice to the same words. "Grandmaster Bai, your presence is requested." At that point, Bai Xiaochun appeared up above on the deck of the heavenly airship, his hands clasped behind his back. After giving an approving glance at Zhou Yixing, he flew out and landed in front of the 3,000-man brigade. "I am your humble servant Wu Dao," the colonel said. "Greetings, Grandmaster Bai. If you have any requests, then your humble servant will do anything and everything possible to see them fulfilled." With that, Colonel Wu Dao clasped hands and bowed even more deeply than before. Bai Xiaochun felt wonderful about how everything was playing out. Laughing heartily, he hurried forward to pull the colonel up from his bow. "There's no need for all that, fellow Taoist Wu," he said with a sincere smile. "I actually have a very weak cultivation base. The Grand Heaven Master sent me here to work on my necromancy, and I'm sure that I'm going to need a lot of help from you in the days to come." This was just how Bai Xiaochun was. When people treated him courteously, he would treat them even more courteously in return. Of course, Wu Dao responded by looking even more respectful and awestruck than before. Inwardly, he was actually a bit impressed with this Grandmaster Bai. Despite being an earthly necromancer, he wasn't arrogant at all. The colonel could immediately tell that there was more to him than met the eye. He had first mentioned his own weakness, then brought up the Grand Heaven Master, and had then gone on to imply that he was only here to work on necromancy, and not stay long-term. That went to show that he wasn't interested in usurping the colonel's position or power. Actually, even Wu Dao himself didn't feel that the force he commanded was worth much, therefore he was very pleased to be treated in such a way. Bai Xiaochun had already succeeded at making a good impression. The soldiers quickly clustered around him and led him toward the military base in the Underworld River restricted area. After all the formalities were taken care of, Wu Dao gave Bai Xiaochun the best residence, as well as a detailed explanation about everything to do with the Underworld River restricted area. Eventually, evening began to fall, whereupon he handed over 2 command medallions and then took his leave. Bai Xiaochun's residence was not out in the open, it was enclosed by high walls. That, coupled with the fact that it was in the middle of a military base, made it seem particularly safe and secure. Furthermore, it didn't consist of just a single room, but rather, a main room and 2 side rooms. Bai Xiaochun was very pleased. After Wu Dao left, Zhou Yixing set up some spell formations to secure the area. Then he reported in to Bai Xiaochun. Wu Dao was telling the truth, "My lord," he said, keeping his voice down. "Every night at midnight, the Underworld River manifests here. When that happens, you can only get close to the river itself if you have a special command medallion. Supposedly, this location isn't the source of the Underworld River, but it's still a powerful convergence between life and death. That's why the Underworld River appears here. In fact, it's the only place in all of the wildlands where the river will manifest naturally. Because of its unique properties, this area is a perfect place for necromancers to seek enlightenment. Whenever the Underworld River manifests, countless souls will appear, which can be harvested using special methods. Of course, there is danger involved, as one might expect." All of these things had been told to Bai Xiaochun by Wu Dao. However, Zhou Yixing had used his own special ways of verifying the information to make sure it was true. Bai Xiaochun nodded. He was already feeling a lot more relaxed now that he was away from the maelstrom that was Archemperor City. No longer did he have to constantly worry about how to deal with the aristocracy, nor did he have to be on guard all the time. Although he didn't have his corpse trooper army to rely on, he was still in high spirits. After a moment passed, Zhou Yixing lowered his voice even more and said, "My lord, what about Songke?" Bai Xiaochun smacked himself on the forehead when he realized that he had once again forgotten about Songke. Back when they had left the city, he had instructed Zhou Yixing to put Songke in a bag of holding to take along, but in the months since then, he hadn't released him into the open even once. "What a bad uncle I've been," he thought guiltily. He immediately told Zhou Yixing to bring Songke out of the bag of holding. When he appeared in the open, he looked a bit pale, and was even gasping for breath. Being stuck in a bag of holding for so many months had almost suffocated him. After getting his bearings, he glared resentfully at Bai Xiaochun. In response, Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat in embarrassment and then reached out to touzle Songke's hair. Although this felt very strange to Songke, he didn't dare to dodge out of the way. Actually, he had come to realize that, from the moment he had arrived in the inspection's manor, this Bai Hao had actually treated him quite well. Not only had he given him cultivation resources, as well as a measure of safety, but he had also allowed him quite a bit of freedom. After all the time that had passed, he had mostly recovered from his previous ordeals. In fact, his cultivation base had even progressed some. He was even convinced that, although he had not yet surpassed Bai Xiaochun, as long as he continued to follow this Bai Hao and benefit from the cultivation resources he provided, it was entirely likely that he soon would. HMPH. Even if I can't surpass Bai Xiaochun right away, I'm definitely in a much better position than he is. He might be well known, but he's obviously scurrying around like a mouse, running from everybody and scared to even show his face. In fact, if he does show his face, he'll definitely be killed within the blink of an eye. All of a sudden, Song Ke came to the conclusion that meeting this Bai Hao had been a stroke of good luck. Even if he was being treated somewhat like a pet, it was worth it, and he would do everything he could to stick with Bai Hao. A pet? So be it. This is the Wildlands, and nobody knows who I am anyway. HMPH. Maybe I'm a pet, but at least I'm the pet of an earthly necromancer. Bai Xiaochun doesn't even qualify to be a pet right now. Comforting himself in this way, he pushed his head up a bit farther so that Bai Xiaochun could touzle his hair a bit more deeply. Of course, Bai Xiaochun could immediately tell what he was thinking. Is this guy really thinking about stomping me beneath his feet? Blinking a few times at how amusing the situation was, he contemplated what would happen if Song Ke ever found out who he really was. What kind of expression would appear on his face? However, even Bai Xiaochun felt that such a thing would be too evil. Whatever. I'm his uncle after all, and the type of person who is very pure at heart. I can't tell him the brutal truth right now. Sighing, he mused about how wonderful of a person he was, and also about how loyal and devoted he was to Song Junwan. In the end, it was just like the old saying, if you love me, you have to love my dog too. Very well then, you'll be living here now. Focus well on your cultivation. After offering a few more words of advice, he had Zhou Yixing arrange for Song Ke to act as a spirit servant. Song Ke took a deep breath, clasped hands and bowed deeply. Sighing, he reminded himself that as long as he stuck close to Bai Hao, then Bai Xiaochun didn't count for anything. Although he couldn't consider himself to truly be on Bai Hao's side, he knew that right now, he had to do anything he could to stay alive. After sending Song Ke away, Bai Xiaochun looked around the main courtyard. As the darkness of night deepened, the underworld river restricted area grew increasingly quiet. Back in Arch-Emperor City, the city would be bustling at this time of night. Although the inspections manor itself would be quiet, even the areas around it would be alive. But here, everything was dead quiet. Considering how unused Bai Xiaochun was to such a thing, he quickly patted his bag of holding and produced a soul-hoarding pagoda, from which Bai Hao flew out. Bai Hao could tell that this area was very unique. After looking around, he lowered his voice and said, Master, this underworld river restricted area seems very similar to the necromancer kettle. The aura is like that of life and death at the same time. It's very strange, and also, very nourishing to souls. Nourishing? Bai Xiaochun said, looking over at Bai Hao and noticing how he looked a lot more corporeal than normal. Surprised himself, Bai Hao nodded, then sat down cross-legged and began to breathe deeply. Almost immediately, he could sense some sort of energy in the area that Bai Xiaochun was oblivious to, which quickly began to pour into his soul body. Bai Xiaochun was very happy about this. Although this whole underworld river restricted area seemed like a boring place so far, if it was helpful to Hauer, then that would make things a bit more bearable. As Bai Hao continued with his cultivation, Bai Xiaochun sent his divine sense out into the underworld river restricted area. It actually wasn't a very large area. It consisted of an expansive bluff, at the top of which was the military base. From the military base, the ground sloped down gradually, until a dry riverbed was visible off in the distance. After midnight, that riverbed was where the underworld river would appear. Retracting his divine sense, Bai Xiaochun sat down cross-legged next to his apprentice to stand guard. As he did, he reviewed the steps necessary to conjure 18-colored flame, and mentally rehearsed them to attempt to get more familiar with the process. Time passed. Before long, midnight was approaching. Zhou Yixing had gone out earlier to confer with Wu Dao about a few matters pertaining to the defenses of the military base. Upon returning, he saw Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao both sitting there cross-legged, with Bai Xiaochun clearly standing watch. The night deepened, until the only light visible was that of the stars and the moon. It was at that point that a knocking sound could be heard on the door of the residence. Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes and watched as Zhou Yixing stepped over and opened the door. After he did, Wu Dao entered, then clasped hands in Bai Xiaochun's direction. Grandmaster Bai, the underworld river will become visible soon. Considering it happens every day, we soldiers are used to it. But since this is your first time, Grandmaster Bai, I suggest you not miss it. You're absolutely right, fellow Taoist Wu, Bai Xiaochun replied. Considering I've never seen it before, I should definitely take a look. How about you stay here, and we can observe it together? In response to Bai Xiaochun's friendly invitation, Wu Dao sat down next to him and offered some further explanations. The first time I saw the underworld river, I was completely shaken, he said, an entranced gleam appearing in his eyes. It was almost as if heaven and earth were being opened up in front of my very eyes. It was really shocking. Just when he was about to say more, rumbling sounds could be heard from the sky. It sounded like heavenly thunder, and immediately caused Bai Xiaochun and Zhou Yixing to both look up into the sky. Wu Dao was the only one whose expression didn't change. It's midnight. The underworld river is about to appear. As soon as the words left his mouth, another intense rumbling sound filled the air. The sky distorted, sending ripples out for tens of thousands of meters in all directions, filling nearly half the sky. Gurgle, gurgle, gurgle. Something like the sound of water could be heard, which rapidly grew louder and clearer. At the same time, a mist began to fill the underworld river restricted area. It was a mist that seemed to be filled with an aura of death, the type which could cause frost to appear wherever it went. In fact, it quickly became so cold that the impure vital energy which everyone breathed out transformed into white clouds that floated up into the air. Bai Xiaochun could immediately tell that the aura of death in the area was unprecedentedly strong. In any other location, such a strong aura of death would indicate that a huge number of vengeful souls was present. But at the moment, Bai Hao was the only soul body visible anywhere. As Bai Xiaochun looked around curiously, the sound of rushing water grew stronger, and the rippling in the sky more intense, as if both space and time were being distorted. The ripples reached the dry riverbed, and then suddenly, river water exploded out from nowhere. Incredible rumbling echoed out as a majestic river came into being right in the middle of that dry riverbed. Surging and seething, it flowed off into the distance. The river wasn't clear, but instead, black. As it surged, the restricted area was filled with an even more intense aura of death, and the mists grew denser. The military base on the bluff wasn't affected, though, allowing Bai Xiaochun and everyone else present to have a very clear view of what was happening. Shockingly, masses of vengeful souls were now visible in the water. Some screamed, some slept, some struggled viciously, some laughed. However, all of them moved with the flow of the river to disappear off into the distance. Bai Xiaochun was shocked, and even Bai Hao had opened his eyes in surprise. Zhou Yixing's response was a sharp gasp. However, Wu Dao was clearly used to the scene. Expression the same as ever, he smiled and said, "We traced the river to its end, a few dozen kilometers away. There's an ordinary mountain there that the river simply disappears into. This is what happens every night, and it lasts all the way until dawn." Focusing his attention on the river, Bai Xiaochun rose to his feet. He was already very curious about the matter. He had heard many things about the underworld river since he'd come to the wildlands, but this was his first time hearing about anything like this. According to the legends, Zhou Yixing muttered, "At the true end of the underworld river is the Hell Emperor Palace, within which is that figure which everyone in the wildlands worships." The Hell Emperor. Bai Xiaochun also thought about the legends of the Hell Emperor, and couldn't help but peer through the mists at the underworld river. As soon as he did, a tremor passed through him, and his eyes widened in disbelief. Pointing down at the river, he gasped and said, "There's someone there." Zhou Yixing and Wu Dao were both shocked, and looked down at both banks of the river. However, neither of them could see anyone. "I don't see anybody," Zhou Yixing said. "You guys don't see him? Look, right there. It's an old man. He's wearing a black robe, and just sitting there." Bai Xiaochun closed his eyes for a moment, and then reopened them. Sure enough, sitting right there on the bank of the river was an old man in a black robe, with his back to them. It looked like he was fishing. Zhou Yixing was convinced that Bai Xiaochun was not simply trying to frighten them, and was thus deeply shaken. And yet, no matter how he looked, he couldn't see anything along the bank of the river. Wu Dao's expression flickered, and after a moment of hesitation and further examination, a strange expression appeared on his face. "Grandmaster Bai, there really isn't anyone there." Stunned, Bai Xiaochun looked at Zhou Yixing for confirmation, who simply smiled and nodded. Heart-pounding, Bai Xiaochun looked back. The black-robed old man was still sitting there just like before. By this point, Bai Xiaochun realized that there was something familiar about him, although he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "Am I the only one who can see him?" he said, face turning pale and scalp tingling. However, it was at this point that Bai Hao's nervous voice was transmitted into his mind. "Master, I can see him too. There's an old man there, fishing." After a moment, Wu Dao took his leave, still a bit suspicious about everything. He even took some subordinates over to the underworld river bank to search around, but none of them found anything. As for Bai Xiaochun, he could clearly see an old man sitting next to where Wu Dao was now standing by the riverbank, and yet, Wu Dao didn't seem to be able to see the old man at all. Feeling very nervous, Bai Xiaochun watched the old man the entire night. He simply sat there, fishing until dawn came, whereupon he faded away along with the underworld river. The next day, Bai Xiaochun was completely jumpy, and even plastered himself with some paper talismans he had in his bag of holding. And yet, that didn't make him feel much better. When Bai Hao saw how nervous his master was, he hesitated for a moment before saying, "Master, why don't we go over tonight to take a closer look? It almost seems like he's calling me." "You really have the guts to go for a closer look?" Bai Xiaochun said nervously. "Howard, you listen to me. That guy's not a soul, he's a ghost. Souls aren't very scary. After all, I've used a lot of souls in my necromancy." "No, that's a ghost. Don't let him hypnotize you. In fact, considering that old ghost has shown up, we need to get out of here. This place is dangerous. Howard, back when your master was in the fallen sword abyss, I saw a girl ghost. Even thinking about that causes chills to go up my spine." Whenever Bai Xiaochun thought about it, he realized that one of the main reasons he was so afraid of ghosts was because of that little girl back in the fallen sword abyss. Then he thought about how that girl had possessed Gongsun Wanner, and then done all those strange things in the labyrinth, and his heart trembled with even more fear than before. Bai Hao hesitated for a moment, and then said, "But I'm a ghost too." "You're different. That's an old ghost. Old ghosts like that who have existed for many years are always very vicious." Even as he spoke, he smacked a few more paper talismans down onto himself. Bai Hao blinked a few times but didn't say anything more to try to convince Bai Xiaochun. And thus the day passed in relative agony for Bai Xiaochun. Eventually, midnight came again, and the rumbling sounds filled the sky. The sky rippled, and the underworld river began to rush through the riverbed. And then, once again, Bai Xiaochun saw that black-robed old man sitting on the river bank. "There he is again," he gasped, his face falling. Turning, he called out to Zhou Yixing, absolutely convinced that this evil place was haunted and that they shouldn't stay there. "I'm an earthly necromancer. Any ghost that would dare to appear in front of me must be incredibly powerful." With that, he immediately sent Zhou Yixing and Song Ke to work packing bags to get ready to leave. However, moments later, he realized that their small party was missing someone. "Where's Howard?" he blurted. Spinning, and eyes widening, he noticed that Bai Hao was floating down toward the underworld river, seemingly in a trance. He was almost halfway to the bank, and was only a few hundred meters away from the black-robed old man. "This is ridiculous bullying, you old ghost." Bai Xiaochun growled angrily. Although he was afraid, his anger over the fact that this old ghost was hypnotizing his apprentice caused him to start shaking physically. Letting out a shout, he began to speed toward the underworld river. As he moved, he smacked his bag of holding, producing numerous paper talismans, which he smacked down all over himself. "Let go of my disciple, you old ghost." Although he was moving quickly, it was to his surprise that he found he couldn't perform any teleportations. Even still, he was like a beam of light that shot toward Bai Hao, who was now only about 300 meters away from the old man. After closing in, he reached out and grabbed him. Bai Hao shivered as he came to his senses. Then his face fell. As for Bai Xiaochun, he was relieved to see Bai Hao regain his senses, and yet, it was only a moment later that his terror spiked as he realized that the old man had noticed him. Oh so slowly, the man began to turn around. As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun felt a sensation of terror that was impossible to even comprehend. Gripping Bai Hao tight, he screamed and prepared to flee. However, that was when the old man's face became visible, and although his expression was cold and sinister, as soon as Bai Xiaochun caught sight of his features, his scream died, and he stood there with an incredulous look on his face. "Great-grandpa Gravekeeper," he blurted. This old man was none other than the mysterious black-robed figure who had saved him back in his spirit stream sect days. During the fighting in those nameless mountains, he had been mortally wounded by a chosen of the Luokan clan, and had then encountered this very black-robed old man. This old man had not only saved his life, he gave him part of the Undying Codex. Never could Bai Xiaochun have imagined that after all the years that had passed, he would encounter this benefactor right here on the banks of the underworld river. Instantly, his fear vanished, and was replaced with joy. Meanwhile, the gravekeeper looked at Bai Xiaochun coolly for a moment, then looked back toward the river and started fishing again. "Master, you know him?" Bai Hao had been struck with fear merely by looking at this old man. Were it not for his master, he would probably have fallen right into the underworld river because of the days he had entered. "Of course I know him. This is the benefactor that I've told you about so many times." Bai Xiaochun's eyes were already shining. He could tell that this gravekeeper was an incredible individual. After all, he had been able to pull Bai Xiaochun back from the very brink of death. Despite how his own cultivation base had climbed far beyond the level it had been that year, even now he couldn't ascertain the gravekeeper's level. That was saying a lot, considering that Bai Xiaochun had encountered demigods before. And yet, the feeling he got from the gravekeeper was that he was beyond the demigod level. More powerful than a demigod. Heavens! What level of cultivation base does Great-Grandpa Gravekeeper have? Enthused, he hurried over to the gravekeeper's side. Great-Grandpa Gravekeeper, he said, it's me, Bai Xiaochun. I'm wearing a mask, so you can't see my real face. Sir, do you remember what happened back in those mountains? It seemed like the gravekeeper hadn't even heard him, he simply went on fishing. Bai Xiaochun was nervous, but also knew that he had to seize this rare opportunity. After a moment of hesitation, he said, Great-Grandpa Gravekeeper, can you help me out here? Send me back to the Heavenspan River? What'd you say? However, the gravekeeper didn't seem to be listening. No matter what Bai Xiaochun said, he didn't respond at all. Bai Xiaochun kept talking until his mouth turned dry and dawn was approaching. And yet, the entire time, the gravekeeper never even looked at him. Eventually, he faded away along with the underworld river. What do we do now, master? Bai Hao said. He had been standing there the entire time while his master uttered countless words. Bai Xiaochun sighed and waved his hand dismissively. Master is going to teach you a lesson today, my apprentice. It's called if you set your mind to it, you can crush rocks and tear apart metal. During the course of the following half-month, Bai Hao came to fully understand exactly how focused his master could be. Every single night at midnight, Bai Xiaochun would go find the gravekeeper and go through another round of entreaties just like he had the first night. Zhou Yixing and Wu Dao were completely taken aback by what was happening. Of course, all they could see was Bai Xiaochun acting like a maniac, standing by the bank of the river talking to himself. And since they couldn't hear what he was saying, it made the whole scene even stranger. On one occasion, an underworld rainbow appeared near Bai Xiaochun, and when Wu Dao and the others went to harvest it, they could see up close what it looked like when he muttered to himself. It was really shocking, and they left as soon as they could. Bai Xiaochun ignored all of the stares. After all, he knew that the remarkable powers of the gravekeeper made him vastly more powerful than even the Grand Heaven Master. However, not even half a month of fawning prompted the gravekeeper to pay him even an iota of attention. By this point, Bai Xiaochun felt like a ball of fire that was starting to sputter out. It was also obvious that only he and Bai Hao were able to see the gravekeeper, who simply sat there the entire time fishing. Of course, what he was fishing for was vengeful souls, not fish. The vengeful souls would always struggle mightily to take the bait, and yet, the gravekeeper only took away one vengeful soul per day. Bai Xiaochun sighed and looked at the gravekeeper, then turned with a frown to glance at the underworld river. Next to him was Bai Hao, who had witnessed his master working hard for an entire month, with no results to show for it. Lowering his voice, he said, Master, this member of the senior generation is anything but ordinary. Don't feel discouraged. I know, Bai Xiaochun replied through gritted teeth. This guy is definitely anything but ordinary. However, you don't need to worry. Master has a lot of experience dealing with old guys like this. Bai Xiaochun was mostly convinced that he had just taken the wrong angle. Therefore, the next night, he found a fishing pole, sat down next to the gravekeeper, and started fishing with him. Becoming kindred spirits with someone can work wonders. Fully convinced, he sat there fishing with the gravekeeper for another half a month while Bai Hao looked on, not sure what to make of the situation. By this point, an entire month had gone by, and yet no matter what Bai Xiaochun did, the gravekeeper didn't pay him any attention. Finally, Bai Xiaochun sighed and decided to just give up. Scowling, he said, However, in this instance I've chosen to teach you an important lesson via my own actions. It's true that if you set your mind to it, you can crush rocks and tear apart metal. However, sometimes the wrong person comes along, and you'll end up wasting your time. Bai Hao blinked a few times but ended up holding his tongue and nodding in response. And yet, despite Bai Xiaochun claiming that it was time to give up, he simply couldn't bring himself to actually do it. Not wanting to waste time, though, he decided to practice working with 19-colored flame. Well, sometimes when you want to get something done, you have to do it yourself. If this old codger is going to be too stubborn to help, then my only other option is to improve my flame conjuring ability, and achieve a cultivation-based breakthrough. Once I step into the Diva realm, then I can easily cross the wildlands on my own. He sighed inwardly. Despite the fact that 19-colored flame could only be conjured by earthly necromancers, the fact was that Bai Hao's formula still wasn't complete. Over the following few days, Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao discussed flame conjuring in 19-colored flame, right there next to the underworld river and the gravekeeper. Although, as far as they were concerned, the gravekeeper might as well have not been there. Bai Hao had his theories, and Bai Xiaochun had his experience. Working together, they began to make progress. Not quickly, but not slowly either. Unfortunately, there were certain areas that left them stymied and at an impasse, no matter what new angles they came up with. This isn't going to work, Bai Xiaochun said. When conjuring 18-colored flame, I can only get it to work in the 9-meter state. However, if I do things the same with 19-colored flame, then it seems to me that it would only work in a 3-meter state. That's the only way I would be able to spot the new color. And that would be so difficult it would basically be impossible. Bai Xiaochun was getting frustrated, and Bai Hao was lost in thought. If only there were a way to get those colors to stop flickering so quickly. Bai Hao muttered. Unfortunately, it would probably require a lot of outside force. His eyes flickered with the light of augury, but even after a protracted period of time, he didn't come up with any new ideas. Bai Xiaochun also racked his brains, and yet, it was to no avail. Another 7 days went by, during which time they continued to remain stuck in the same place. That night, Bai Xiaochun finally began to consider giving up on his work with 19-colored flame, and just let the ideas come naturally over time. However, it was in that exact moment that the gravekeeper, who hadn't said a single word during all of these weeks, suddenly spoke in a gravelly voice. Why are you trying to get the flames to flicker more slowly? Why don't you try to split the new color into multiple parts? That way, you'll have more chances of spotting it. His words struck both Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao like a bolt of lightning. Master and apprentice both stared at each other, their eyes shining brightly. It all made complete sense. In Bai Xiaochun's attempts to conjure 18-colored flame, he had always worked with a single portion of that new color. However, if there were 100 such portions of color, or even 10, then even if the flickering occurred more quickly, he would still have plenty of chances to get lucky and latch onto the new color. That's right, it makes perfect sense. Master, let's rework everything from 15-colored flame upward. Then, by the time we get to 19-colored flame, there will be plenty more of the new color to work with. Delighted, Bai Hao's eyes began to flicker with even more augury light. Clearly, he was very moved. Bai Xiaochun was equally excited. It seemed like a simple idea, the type that anyone would be able to understand upon first hearing it. But considering how much of a rut they had been stuck in, without someone to point it out to them, they might have wasted a huge amount of time coming up with it on their own. Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath, stood, and then clasped hands to the gravekeeper, as did Bai Hao. However, the gravekeeper didn't have anything more to say, and simply continued fishing. At the moment, Bai Xiaochun didn't have the time to ponder the gravekeeper. He continued to contemplate the matter as Bai Hao performed auguries. Several days later, they resolved the issue. That didn't mean that Bai Xiaochun was completely ready to work with 19-colored flame, but it did provide immense help to his ability with 18-colored flame. In fact, it immediately improved his success rate. Now, the only main limitation he faced was getting all of the 17-colored flame he needed to create an 18-colored flame. From now on, he wouldn't be able to use any type of 17-colored flame other than tongues conjured by himself. Generally speaking, the whole method needed to be started from 15-colored flame. However, that wasn't necessarily a huge problem for Bai Xiaochun. Although he had only come up with this new idea recently, the boost it gave him when working with 18-colored flame was worth it. After all, each failure with 18-colored flame meant a massive loss of resources. A few words from the gravekeeper had resolved a major issue for this master and apprentice team. Therefore, after exchanging a glance, they began to continue their discussion about various issues regarding 19-colored flame, all right there in front of the gravekeeper. When you take 10 tongues of 18-colored flame and combine them, the fluctuations and instabilities make it difficult for them to merge together. The pressure created after merging them, and the way they contract, are both big problems. What are we supposed to do? It would be difficult considering my current cultivation base level. Also, I wonder if 19-colored flame comes with lightning tribulation. All sorts of questions poured out of their mouths, and after each one, they would cast sidelong glances at the gravekeeper. As long as he didn't say anything, they could continue the discussion along related subjects. Eventually, it was with a bit of a begrudging expression that the gravekeeper offered some more advice. Every time he did, Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao were thrilled. Slowly but surely, all of their issues were being resolved. With the help of the gravekeeper, Bai Xiaochun's skill in flame conjuring slowly improved, and Bai Hao's understanding of the theories involved grew more profound. In fact, Bai Hao seemed to benefit even more than Bai Xiaochun. Everything the gravekeeper said seemed to strike him like lightning, leaving him more confident, and his formulas more complete. Eventually, he realized that what he was doing was very specific and unique. The formulas he was creating were all based on Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base, divine sense, and strong suits. In all of the wildlands, Bai Xiaochun would be the only person who would actually be able to use this formula to concoct flame. Another few months sped by. Bai Xiaochun was completely immersed in his flame-conjuring research, as was Bai Hao. Although they still took time to rest when necessary, they worked so hard that Bai Xiaochun's skill grew significantly on a daily basis. Master and apprentice both advanced by leaps and bounds in a very short period of time. It was almost impossible to describe how much they were benefiting. And although no expression could be seen on the gravekeeper's face, deep within his eyes was a gleam of a smile. He appeared to be ignoring Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao, but the truth was that he was actually paying more attention to them than to his fishing. As master and apprentice discussed various matters, it was impossible for Bai Hao to hide the reverence and love in his eyes. At the same time, it was also impossible for Bai Xiaochun to disguise how much he cared for his apprentice. When the gravekeeper saw that, the smile deep within his eyes grew wider. Time became a blur as several months passed. The better part of a year had now passed since Bai Xiaochun came to the Underworld River restricted area, and most of that time, he and his apprentice had been completely immersed in their flame-conjuring research. In fact, neither of them really had any idea how much time had passed. During the day, they would discuss 19-colored flame, and during the evening, they would hurry over to the bank of the Underworld River to continue their discussion in the presence of the gravekeeper, making sure to emphasize all of the difficult areas they had been unable to resolve earlier. Sometimes the gravekeeper wouldn't help them with a certain issue. But when that happened, they would continue to chatter about the matter until he gave in and offered some advice. Both Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao experienced an increase in their flame-conjuring skill, and also grew more confident when it came to 19-colored flame. That was especially true of Bai Hao, who knew that he was just on the verge of producing the formula. As for Bai Xiaochun, he was so immersed in the process that he knew that as soon as the formula appeared, he would be able to conjure a 19-colored flame immediately. In the past, Bai Xiaochun could never have imagined that he would reach the point of being able to conjure 19-colored flame so quickly after mastering 18-colored flame. Despite his strong faith in Bai Hao, he had assumed the process would take years. 19-colored flame was even more rare than 18-colored flame. In fact, it was possible to say that while 18-colored flame might occasionally be seen at huge auctions in the wildlands, as for 19-colored flame, it only came around once in 100 years. For all intents and purposes, 19-colored flame was a thing of the past. Any such flames which currently existed would have been conjured by previous generations of earthly necromancers and then hidden away like buried treasure. Currently, there were only 3 people in the wildlands who could conjure 18-colored flame. Of those 3, 2 were actually stuck at that level, with only one of them ever having succeeded with 19-colored flame. From this it was possible to see how incredibly rare 19-colored flames were. If Bai Xiaochun succeeded, and word spread out into the wildlands, it would cause a major stir. In fact, it might even cause a greater stir than when he had reached the earthly rank. That mere thought got him even more excited than before. After all, never before in history had an earthly necromancer made progress as quickly as Bai Xiaochun right now. However, he wasn't really thinking about such things at the moment, nor did he have time to feel pleased with himself. He was completely focused on 19-colored flame, to the exclusion of almost everything else. By now, Zhou Yixing, Wu Dao, and the others present were used to seeing Bai Xiaochun muttering to himself on the banks of the Underworld River. Occasionally, people would go eavesdrop, but all they would hear was talk of 19-colored flame, most of which was unintelligible even to necromancers such as Zhou Yixing. Thanks to Bai Xiaochun's mask, Wu Dao didn't even notice Bai Hao. The better part of a year passed, and talk of Bai Xiaochun's escapades within Arch-Emperor City was finally starting to die down. Of course, all it took was for someone to mention necromancers, or heavenly marquises and dukes, or for someone to say the name of Bai Hao, and it would be easy to see how much he had shaken the city. During the time which passed, there were certain people in Arch-Emperor City who continued to scheme against him. After all, their hatred for him was not something that would easily dissipate because of a bit of time passing. That was especially true because the Grand Heaven Master continued to enforce the proclamation of universal grace throughout the wildlands. Slowly but surely, things were stabilizing. Unless something very drastic happened, it would only take a few more years for the very structure of the Arch-Emperor dynasty to completely change. No one could say for sure whether that change would be a good thing for the dynasty, or a bad thing. Although the influential clans had seemingly been dismembered, the truth was that the constant struggles of the bastard children and the common people showed that the wildlands' overall battle prowess was as formidable as ever. There were some people, for example those from the direct bloodlines of important clans, who were becoming more desperate than ever to do something to Bai Xiaochun. However, whenever they tried to send people into the Underworld River restricted area, those people went missing. Not even Wu Dao and his men were aware of that fact. They didn't even know people had infiltrated the area. If they didn't know, there was even less need to mention Zhou Yixing or even Bai Xiaochun. No one had any idea how many people had come to the Underworld River restricted area to harm Bai Xiaochun, only to vanish. That was quite a shock to the people who had been plotting against him, and soon none of them dared to do anything further. No one disturbed Bai Xiaochun as he worked on his flame conjuring. Several more months went by. One night, a look of excitement lit up Bai Hao's face. Bai Xiaochun was also so excited he was trembling. It worked. Master, we did it. We created the formula for 19-colored flame. This formula belongs to you and you alone, Master. Even with the formula, no one else would be able to conjure this type of 19-colored flame. It's yours, Master. Not only was Bai Xiaochun excited, he also knew that the past year had been one of drastic progress in flame conjuring skill. And of course, the main reason for it all was the help of the Gravekeeper. Many thanks, Great-Grandpa Gravekeeper, he said, bowing deeply. Bai Hao also excitedly clasped hands and bowed to the Gravekeeper. The Gravekeeper sat there, face expressionless as he continued to fish. Of course, Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao were used to that. Bursting with excitement, they continued to discuss the finer details of 19-colored flame for a bit. Then Bai Xiaochun calmed himself and prepared to actually conjure a 19-colored flame, right there next to the Underworld River. There was no tribulation that came with 19-colored flame. That was something that the Gravekeeper had explained recently, and which Bai Xiaochun didn't doubt at all. Besides, even if some sort of tribulation came, he was sure that it wouldn't count for crap with the Gravekeeper there. It was with complete and utter confidence that Bai Xiaochun went on to begin conjuring 19-colored flame. Eyes glittering, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture to produce a vast quantity of 15-colored flame. These flames had been conjured during his research and study during the past year or so with Bai Hao. As for other necessary ingredients, although he had ceased to be the inspections commissioner after rising to the earthly rank, and had thus been incapable of performing shakedowns, he had still been showered with gifts by well-wishers. Everyone from Sima Dao to Sun Yifan had come, as well as many other outstanding individuals. Therefore, when the time had come to leave Arch-Emperor City, he did so with no less wealth than he had accumulated after all the shakedowns. Beyond that was everything he had been given by the clans he had visited when taking the heavenly airship trip. It was really impossible to count how much he had built up before actually arriving at the Underworld River restricted area. And that was what he would rely on to build up to a 19-colored flame. He settled his chi and cleared his mind, then began to slowly work with the 15-colored flames. His process was completely innovative. He was taking an entirely new path to get to 19-colored flame, to the point where he even used new methods to conjure the 16 and 17-colored flames. Before long, he actually had 10 tongues of 17-colored flame hovering around him, which he then began to compress. When he merged the flames together, creating a huge sea of fire, immense pressure began to weigh down on him. However, he clearly knew exactly what he was doing. He casually compressed the sea of fire down to a size of 15 meters. The flames began to flicker, and yet, that was exactly what he had been expecting. Furthermore, 80% of them were made up of the 18th color. It almost wasn't even necessary to look at them. Bai Xiaochun sent some divine sense out, and the flickering of the flames didn't bother him at all. Almost instantly, he found the 18th color, and then reached out and grabbed it. The sea of fire began to shrink down into his palm, after which he opened his fingers, revealing a full 18-colored flame. After breathing a sigh of relief, he marveled at how smoothly it had gone, then threw his head back and laughed heartily. He now felt more confident than ever about conjuring 19-colored flame. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.